The sea was black and heavy, a crushing, endless weight above the steel skin of the submarine. Inside, the air was thick with oil, sweat, and fear. The men had stopped talking hours ago. Every whisper, every movement, seemed loud enough to summon death. The last pattern of depth charges had rolled away into silence, leaving only the faint creak of the hull under pressure. Somewhere aft, a trickle of water hissed through a weld seam and dripped into the bilge. The captain of the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine sat in the control room, motionless, his gloved hand resting on the chart table. His name was Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Takamura, a veteran of the South Seas campaign, a man who had stalked American convoys off Guadalcanal when the war had still seemed winnable. He knew the ocean's voices, screw beats, cavitation, sonar echoes, the shifting song of current and hull resonance. But what he heard now was something he had never known. It came first as a faint pulse in the water metal, striking metal, sharp and measured, echoing down through the pressure hull like the ticking of a giant clock. Ping, ping, ping. The sound was clean, deliberate, and terrifying. It was not the random hammer of depth charges, not the murmur of propellers, not chance. It was purpose, calculation, geometry made audible. The crew froze. Men who had endured years of combat felt their hearts turn cold. The sonar operator, a boy of 20, wiped the sweat from his headphones and whispered, "Kikoe masu. I can hear them. They are searching." The captain's voice was quiet, almost calm. "How far?" "Hard to say, sir. Less than 1,000 meters, maybe closer. The echo is strong." He knew what that meant. The Americans were no longer guessing. They had found them, not by luck or by oil slick, but by mathematics, by sound that saw. 2 years earlier, in the waters off Java or the Solomons, this would not have happened. American destroyers had been clumsy hunters, then, their sonar unreliable, their depth charges dropped by instinct and luck. Japanese submarines had dived deep, waited out the confusion, and slipped away. The Imperial Navy had mocked American anti-submarine tactics as amateurish. "They fire blindly," one staff report had said. "They lack the patience and precision of the hunter." But that had been 1942. Now, in 1944, everything was different. The rhythmic pinging grew louder, each note distinct. The captain imagined the enemy above a sleek destroyer escort, perhaps one of the new Buckley or Cannon classes, its hull plated with fresh grey paint, its sonar dome gleaming like a single eye in the bow. In its darkened control room, an American operator sat with his face lit by a green scope, watching their echoes bloom like ghosts. The destroyer's computers, new devices the Japanese barely believed existed, were already plotting range, bearing, depth, course, and speed. The submarine was no longer invisible. It was a number on a chart. "Depth?" Takamura asked. 300 meters, came the answer. 1,000 feet, the captain repeated softly, more to himself than to his men. The hull was near its limit. Any deeper and the ocean would crush them. Any shallower and the Americans would find them faster. There was no good choice left, only time to measure in heartbeats. The sonar pings stopped. Silence fell again, more dreadful than noise. Every man in the control room listened, waiting for the next sound. They all knew what came after silence. The first depth charge detonated well aft, a dull thud that rippled through the hull. The lights flickered, dust and paint fell from the ceiling. The second explosion came closer, sharper, throwing men against bulkheads. The sound was not random, it was walking toward them, bracket by bracket. The Americans were not dumping charges at guesswork intervals. They were adjusting patterns, triangulating. Port ballast. "Tank flooding!" someone shouted. "Hold it steady," Takamura ordered. His voice was iron. "No counter-flooding. Stay quiet." He looked through the periscope housing out of habit, though it was useless in the dark. Somewhere above, the destroyer was listening again, calculating again. Another series of pings started, faster now, like a heartbeat. The captain could almost hear the logic behind each sound. Transmit, receive, range, adjust. It was as if the enemy was whispering to him through the sea, "I know where you are, I will find you." For the first time since the war began, he felt something worse than fear. He felt ignorance. He did not understand how they could do this, how sound could become sight. The manuals of the Imperial Navy spoke of sonar in vague terms, but they treated it as an unreliable trick. They had no countermeasure for this precision. He remembered the briefings at Kure Naval Arsenal in late 1941, when instructors told them that American technology was crude, their crews soft. "Their machines will fail in battle," they had said. "Ours are built with spirit." Spirit did not help at 1,000 feet under the Pacific. Another detonation rolled along the hull, close enough to bow the steel inward like the skin of a drum. Men crossed themselves or prayed to forgotten gods. In the forward compartment, someone began to laugh high, hysterical. A petty officer struck him silent with a single blow. "Prepare to blow ballast," Takamura said quietly. The chief engineer looked at him, astonished. "Sir, if we rise now, they will see us." "They already see us," the captain replied. "We are the blind ones." He hesitated, listening again. The pinging had shifted frequency, higher, faster, perhaps a change of range setting, perhaps a different mode of sonar altogether. It was almost elegant in its rhythm. For a strange moment he admired it. The Americans had built a machine that turned the invisible into certainty. In the torpedo room, the crew began to whisper about ghosts, about how the sea itself had betrayed them. Some believed the Americans had learned magic, a weapon that could hear through steel. Others said the enemy used airplanes to send sound through the air and down into the water. None could accept the truth, that science, not superstition, had outpaced them. Takamura closed his eyes. He saw his training at Etajima, the pride of the Imperial Navy. He saw the instructors teaching that courage and discipline could overcome any enemy. But courage did not bend sonar waves. Discipline did not deflect mathematics. Another string of depth charges detonated above them in perfect sequence, each blast closer than the last. Instruments shattered, the batteries sparked. A column of seawater erupted from a ruptured gasket and sprayed across the chart table, washing away the inked lines of their last plotted course. The captain stared at the water running across his fingers. The ocean was coming in. He turned to his men. "They can see us," he said quietly. "Even in the dark." No one answered. At that moment, above the crushing weight of the Pacific, an American destroyer escort made a slow, deliberate turn to starboard, her sonar dome fixed on the target below. In her operations room, a young ensign adjusted a knob and watched the echo pulse strengthen. "Contact. Steady bearing," he said. The ship's commander nodded. "Set depth charges, pattern Bravo, shallow setting, fire when ready." Down below, the Japanese submarine waited for the ocean to decide its fate. The pings came one last time, precise, final, merciless. Then the water exploded. When the echoes faded, nothing moved at 1,000 feet. The sea, blind and ancient, closed over the wreck and kept its secret. But for those who heard it, that clean metallic rhythm would never be forgotten. It was the sound of a new kind of war, the sound of an enemy that could see in the dark. In the beginning, the ocean belonged to Japan. When the war erupted in the Pacific, Imperial submariners sailed, believing they were the unseen predators of a blind enemy. The Americans, they said, were clumsy and mechanical, slaves to instruments rather than instinct. Japanese officers trusted intuition and silence, the ancient creed of the hunter. Their submarines, long and sleek, were built for offensive strikes against warships, not for convoy escort or attrition. They carried the same spirit as the samurai. The ocean was merely their new battlefield. In those early months of 1942, the belief seemed justified. The attack on Pearl Harbor had stunned the world. Japanese submarines prowled the Hawaiian approaches and the western coast of America, stalking with impunity. In the Indian Ocean, they ambushed British ships. In the South Pacific, they shadowed convoys bound for Australia. The Imperial Navy's official communiques declared a new dominion of the deep. American anti-submarine forces, by contrast, stumbled through those months like men groping in fog. Their destroyers carried sonar sets called ASDIC in the British manuals, but few operators truly understood them. The technology was new, the training crude. Most sailors treated the instruments as temperamental devices that worked only when they wanted to. In after-action reports from 1942, American officers confessed that "contact lost" was the most common phrase in the logbooks. Destroyers would detect a faint echo, race to the point, drop a pattern of depth charges, and then lose all trace of the target. The sea would boil, foam, and fall silent. Oil and air bubbles rose, convincing the hunters they had triumphed. But hours later, the same submarine would surface miles away, alive and mocking. Japanese captains learned to play this deadly game with contemptuous ease. They called it the dance. Dive deep, change course sharply after each explosion, release decoy bubbles, and wait. American sonar could not distinguish between a true echo and a layer of cold water. The destroyers would give up after half an hour, burning too much fuel to continue. Then the hunters became the hunted again, their prey slipping away into the black. One Japanese patrol report from May of that year recorded, "Enemy destroyers attacked with energy but without skill. They waste many depth charges. Their sonar cannot follow us. Their courage is admirable, their methods childish." At that time, American ships still relied on simple listening gear. The QCU and early QCJ sonar sets were effective only within a few hundred yards, and even then, the operator's ear mattered more than the machine. In rough seas or shallow water, the echoes became useless noise. The Japanese knew this. Their intelligence service had studied captured manuals from British sources. The conclusion was confident. Sonar cannot guide a persistent pursuit. It gives only direction, not range. We are safe below 200 meters. The illusion hardened into doctrine. In the naval academies at Etajima and Kure, instructors taught young officers that Western sonar was an overrated toy. They believed the human ear, sharpened by experience, could hear better than any electric device. American machines, they said, lacked spirit, the seishin, that made warriors superior. Even when Japanese submarines began to take losses in late 1942, commanders explained them away as accidents, lucky hits, or betrayal by surface aircraft. The idea that American destroyers might have developed new tactics was unthinkable. The enemy, in Japanese eyes, was still slow, wasteful, and naive. The irony was cruel. For every sinking they dismissed as chance, American scientists were learning, adapting, transforming, while Japanese commanders were boasting of their own cleverness. In San Diego, Pearl Harbor, and New London, teams of engineers and physicists were tearing apart every failed sonar, contact. They examined the timing of echoes, the absorption of sound in temperature layers, the harmonics of propeller noise. They built tanks of seawater in laboratories and filled them with scaled submarine models. In the dim light of those tanks, the future of undersea warfare was being born. By the time the Imperial Navy noticed, it was already too late. The war of attrition was a teacher without mercy. For every submarine that escaped, another was tracked a little longer, a little deeper. American destroyers began staying on station after an attack, holding contact for hours instead of minutes. They learned to listen for the faint echo of a hull sliding silently through water. The crude guesswork of 1942 was turning into something methodical. Yet, the Japanese High Command ignored these warning signs. Intelligence officers filed reports describing increased skill among American escorts, but these were dismissed as exaggerations. "They cannot learn so quickly," one admiral scoffed during a staff meeting in Tokyo. "Their sailors lack devotion." The war itself was changing. American industry was awakening like a forge under full heat. New destroyer escorts rolled out of shipyards every month, each fitted with improved sonar and more precise depth charge projectors. The once rare Hedgehog launcher, firing contact-fused bombs ahead of the ship, entered mass production. It was no longer necessary to guess the depth of a target, the pattern simply filled the ocean with lethal mathematics. Still, the Imperial Navy clung to its illusions. Even in early 1943, training manuals insisted that evasion below 300 meters remained effective. The truth, already recorded in Allied after-action summaries, was the opposite. The new American sonar sets could reach twice that depth and track continuously through turns. Submariners at sea began to sense the shift before their admirals did. Reports from surviving boats grew darker. Enemy escorts now pursue with unnatural accuracy, one commander wrote after escaping an attack near the Solomons. Their charges follow our every maneuver. It is as if they see us. But on land, those reports met disbelief. Tokyo's naval staff reasoned that their own crews had grown fearful, that their spirit had weakened. The idea that the Americans might have built a machine capable of piercing the ocean's blindness was dismissed as defeatist talk. The illusion persisted until the spring of 1944, when Lieutenant Commander Takamura and his crew found themselves drifting at 1,000 feet off Truk Lagoon. In that stifling darkness, they heard the clean, measured rhythm of modern war, a sound that no spirit could defy. The pings were proof that the age of instinct was over. The ocean had become a battlefield of equations, and the Empire's faith in courage had met the mathematics of an enemy that had learned to see through water. By the summer of 1943, the ocean itself had become an American laboratory. The defeat of ignorance was underway, not through speeches or slogans, but through the quiet pulse of sonar transmitted into salt water. What began as desperation in 1942 evolved into the most disciplined transformation of any naval branch during the war. The U.S. Navy had suffered humiliation at the start of the conflict. Dozens of Allied ships were sent to the bottom by Japanese and German submarines, while American destroyers dropped depth charges into empty sea. But behind the public optimism and the press releases, a silent revolution was taking shape. Its architects were not admirals, but scientists. At the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, engineers analyzed every report from the Pacific. They discovered that the ocean was not uniform. Temperature layers bent sound, salinity distorted range. A submarine could hide beneath a thermocline, an invisible wall of warm water that deflected sonar beams downward. To defeat this, they built machines that could compensate oscillators that shifted frequency, amplifiers that could detect the faintest echo returning from hundreds of meters below. At the Submarine Sound School in Key West, Florida, new training doctrines replaced guesswork with discipline. Sonar operators were taught to hear not just the echo, but its shape to distinguish a true target from false reflections. The Americans gave these men months of training with mock submarines and sound simulators. They learned to recognize the heartbeat of a submarine propeller and the flutter of cavitation bubbles. Where Japanese instructors taught intuition, Americans taught measurement. Destroyer captains were drilled in the new doctrine of continuous contact. Instead of racing in for one attack, they circled, plotted, and tracked for hours. They learned patience, the predator's virtue that the Japanese once claimed as their own. By late 1943, this new thinking began to bear fruit. Around the Solomons and the Bismarck Sea, submarines that had once slipped away began disappearing without distress signals. Task force reports noted. Contact prosecuted until all echo faded, no debris observed, but oil slick confirmed. It was no longer luck, it was geometry. Each new destroyer escort emerging from American shipyards was equipped with the QGB or QHB sonar, devices generations ahead of what the Japanese imagined possible. The system could maintain contact while the ship maneuvered a feat the enemy still believed impossible. These sonars transmitted narrow beams, allowing precise range and bearing even through depth layers. The operator saw the sea as a map of invisible sound. The destroyer's new weapon, the Hedgehog, completed the revolution. Designed by British scientists and refined by the Americans, it fired 24 small bombs ahead of the ship in a circular pattern. Each bomb exploded only on contact. No more guessing depth settings, no more losing contact in the shock of one's own explosions. The destroyer no longer charged blindly. It reached forward, calculated, and struck with surgical precision. For the first time in the Pacific, the Americans began to hunt as teams. 2 or 3 destroyer escorts would work together, one maintaining sonar contact, another plotting interception, the third ready to drop depth charges or hedgehogs. Radio silence was maintained. Coordination was done by practiced timing. A single ping, a pause, then the attack pattern. Japanese submariners who survived these hunts described them in tones of disbelief. "The enemy seemed to know our course even before we changed it," one officer said during post-war interrogation. "Their ships circled like wolves. Their weapons came exactly where we hid." Behind this new lethality was another American strength industry. The sonar systems that had once taken weeks to hand-tune could now be mass-produced with precision parts. The U.S. Navy could install a new sonar dome on a destroyer faster than Japan could build a single torpedo. When one escort was sunk, another replaced it within days. In parallel, the Americans built the first true hunter-killer groups, small task forces centered around an escort carrier, carrying aircraft equipped with radar and magnetic anomaly detectors. These planes, patrolling thousands of square miles of ocean, could locate periscopes or surfaced submarines and vector destroyers to the scene. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their submarines sailed blind while the enemy hunted with eyes in the sky and ears in the water. At Pearl Harbor, under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz, the transformation was being formalized. Reports from the Combat Information Centers, CICs, began to speak the new language of war. Echo steady, Doppler closing, execute pattern Charlie. These were the codes of precision, of an army of mathematicians at sea. The effect rippled outward. Aircrews trained to cooperate with destroyers, marking contacts with smoke floats, while sonar tracked below. The once scattered branches of American warfare scientists, sailors, aviators, were now fused into a single, relentless organism. The Japanese noticed the change too late. In the first 6 months of 1944, more than 20 Imperial submarines were sunk in the Central Pacific. Many were lost without even a sighting report. Survivors began to whisper of American ships that could see through the sea, that used invisible pulses to find them no matter how deep they fled. For those few who reached base, the psychological toll was visible. Men who had once mocked the enemy now stared at the floor during debriefings. Their logbooks were filled with the same phrase repeated over and over: "Enemy destroyer, maintained contact without error." Meanwhile, the Americans refined the mathematics. They measured how sound traveled differently in each ocean, how salinity and depth altered its path. Charts of sound channels were drawn for every theater. To the sonar operators, the ocean had become transparent. Aboard each new destroyer escort, in a cramped compartment beneath the bridge, sat the heart of the revolution, the sonar console. 2 men worked there in darkness, headphones pressed tight, one transmitting the pulse, the other reading its return. When the signal came back distorted, they corrected, recalibrated, narrowed the beam. The pinging rhythm that terrified Japanese submariners was, to them, the music of mastery. By early 1944, American escorts were averaging less than 6 hours from first contact to confirmed kill. The sea had become a network of sound and steel. For the Imperial Navy, it was the beginning of the end. The Japanese submariners who dove in 1942 had believed they ruled the deep. Those who dove in 1944 found themselves inside an invisible cage built from sound waves. The hunter had become the hunted, and somewhere in that cage, under the black weight of the Pacific, Lieutenant Commander Takamura would soon learn that the Americans' new vision had turned the ocean itself into their ally, a vast, resonant battlefield where mathematics had replaced chance, and silence was no longer safety but the echo of approaching doom. By February of 1944, Truk Lagoon, once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, had become a tomb. The American carrier raids, known as Operation Hailstone, had smashed the proud anchorage of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Smoke still hung above the shattered reefs, and the lagoon was filled with wreckage, burned cruisers, broken merchantmen, oil slicks spreading like bruises across the turquoise water. In the chaos that followed, Japanese submarines were ordered to save what could be saved, rescue pilots, carry supplies, and evacuate stranded officers. It was a desperate mission, one that would send them into the waiting arms of an enemy that now ruled both sky and sea. When the first submarines approached Truk after the February bombardment, they did not know the Americans had already turned the surrounding waters into a kill zone. The U.S. Navy's destroyer escorts, working in coordination with long-range patrol aircraft, had established invisible barriers of radar, sonar, and hydrophone buoys. Each channel, each approach route, was mapped by sound. The Japanese thought they were slipping through darkness. In truth, they were walking into a trap made of mathematics. Destroyer escort USS England had already demonstrated the new power of American anti-submarine warfare in the South Pacific. Between May 19th and May 31st, 1944, she sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days. Her sonar crew could track targets for hours, adjusting patterns of attack with precision no Japanese commander could comprehend. But even before England's streak of victories, the tactics that doomed Truk's defenders were already in place. North of the lagoon, 2 destroyer escorts, USS Whitehurst and USS McCoy Reynolds, maintained continuous sonar sweeps, their pings echoing down into depths where Japanese boats tried to hide. The Americans no longer hunted at random. They understood the sound channels, the way temperature and salinity curved sonar beams like glass-bending light. They fired their hedgehogs not by guesswork, but by calculated prediction, of course, depth and speed. When I-185 tried to approach Truk in March, she was detected long before she sighted land. Her crew never knew what found them, only that the water around them came alive with sound. A sharp metallic pulse struck the hull again and again, then stopped. Silence. Then the explosions walked inward like a closing fist. No distress call was ever sent. In American records, the kill was noted simply, contact lost, debris and oil observed. For the Japanese command at Truk, these losses were mysterious. Boats reported leaving Saipan or Kwajalein and then vanished. Tokyo ordered more subs to investigate, sending them into the same acoustic graveyard. In the space of 2 months, 7 submarines disappeared without trace. The survivors who eventually escaped described a new horror, an enemy that no longer guessed. One officer wrote in his diary before being lost, "The Americans hear everything. Even the fish must serve them. In the wardrooms of U.S. destroyer escorts." The mood was professional, not triumphant. Sonar operators discussed echoes like mathematicians solving proofs. Each attack was logged with time, range, and bearing. Kill confirmations required oil, debris, or air bubbles. The sea had become a ledger of precision. At night, when operations paused, the sailors of these ships could see Truk burning faintly on the horizon. The glow was red against the clouds, reflected by smoke and flame. Some wondered aloud how many submarines still lay, below, silent and broken. The numbers would never be known exactly, but post-war analysis confirmed that, by mid-1944, more than half of Japan's operational boats in the Central Pacific had been destroyed or crippled. For the Japanese crews that still ventured out, fear replaced arrogance. Once they had believed in the invisibility of the deep, now they dreaded the first metallic ping. Men whispered of the eyes of the Americans, sonar so powerful it could read their names through steel. The old superstitions of the sea returned spirits that lived in the waves, demons that found the guilty. But there was no magic in their destruction, only science, patient and exact. Truk itself, once a symbol of imperial pride, had become a place of ghosts. The harbours that once held battleships were littered with hulks, the airfields cratered and abandoned. From the shattered decks of sunken cruisers, oil rose like incense. American airmen circling overhead described the lagoon as a city drowned in glass. To the few submarines that tried to reach it afterward, the sight was unbearable. They saw the graves of their navy and heard, in the distance, the faint rhythm of sonar sweeping through the water. It was the sound of a new kind of war, a sound that stripped the ocean of its mystery. Lieutenant Commander Takamura, hiding in those same waters weeks later, understood the pattern now. Every explosion, every echo, spoke of a mind above that calculated and observed. The enemy had learned to see, and Truk, once the heart of the Japanese Pacific, had become a monument to that revelation, a graveyard not only of ships and men, but of illusions. The Empire's mastery of the sea had ended, not in a grand battle, but in a slow, methodical erasure carried out by sonar pulses repeating through black water. Each ping was a requiem, each echo a reminder that the ocean's silence no longer belonged to Japan. April of 1944. The ocean west of Truk was black glass beneath a sky without stars. Lieutenant Commander Takamura's submarine, its number long lost to history, drifted blind at 1,000 feet, deeper than any sane captain dared to go. The hull groaned like a wounded animal, each sound a reminder of pressure trying to crush the steel shell around them. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, diesel fumes, and fear. For hours, they had endured the bombardment. The first series of depth charges had missed, but the second had come closer, walking toward them in measured bursts. The crew could tell by the sound. The early attacks in 1942 had been chaotic explosions thrown without pattern, the product of guesswork. These were different. The detonations came in precise intervals, an engineer's cadence. The enemy above was not attacking wildly. It was tracking. At 22:43 hours, the sonar man pressed his ear to the steel bulkhead and froze. A new sound vibrated through the hull, sharp, metallic, and impossibly clear. Not the hollow boom of an explosion, not the rumble of propellers. It was a single pulse, clean and measured, echoing through water like a hammer striking a bell. Then another, exactly 2 seconds later. Then another. Ping, ping, ping. The men looked to their captain. Takamura's face was calm, but his eyes betrayed recognition. This was no ordinary search. The Americans were ranging them with sonar, a weapon of precision, not chance. He whispered, "They have us." In the cramped command room, the chief engineer muttered a prayer. The depth gauge trembled near the red line. The air felt like breathing through cloth. Takamura ordered all engines stopped. Silence, complete and suffocating. Even the ticking of a wristwatch seemed treasonous. Then the pings grew faster. Each one came slightly higher in pitch as the destroyer above adjusted its sonar beam, closing the distance. The pattern was deliberate. 3 long-range pings, then a pause, then shorter, quicker, bursts as they corrected bearing. The crew had never heard anything like it. "They're measuring our depth," whispered the navigator. The captain nodded grimly. "They are counting us in meters." Through the hull, the rhythm continued. Ping, pause, ping, pause, ping. It was as though an unseen intelligence was tapping on their tomb, testing its walls. The sea itself had become the enemy's language. The first depth charge pattern dropped moments later. The explosions were distant, but terrifying in precision, first astern, then forward, then to port. The destroyer was not guessing. It was walking its charges inward, bracketing the submarine's position by computation. Each detonation shifted the water pressure, each echo refined their range. Takamura understood what few in the Imperial Navy yet realized. American sonar was not a crude noisemaker, but a mathematical instrument. It calculated. It predicted. It learned. "Trim the boat by the stern," he ordered quietly. "Fall another 20 meters." The submarine slid deeper into blackness, the pressure groaning against the hull like the breath of some vast animal. Paint flakes drifted in the dim red light of the control room. Someone whispered, "We will be crushed." "Better crushed than found," the captain replied. Above them, the destroyer adjusted again. The sonar pings vanished for 30 seconds, replaced by silence so absolute it hurt the ears. The crew dared to hope they had escaped. Then came a new sound, faint, distant, but distinct, a churning pattern of propellers approaching directly overhead. "New contact," said the hydrophone operator. "Faster screws, smaller ship, escort class." Another destroyer had joined the hunt. The Americans were coordinating. One ship maintained contact while the other maneuvered to intercept. Takamura now faced not one enemy, but a team bound by invisible mathematics and radio codes. He realized, with a cold clarity, that this was the end of the old war. The Imperial Navy had trained him to fight with courage and instinct. The enemy now fought with science and patience. The hunter's art had become an equation. The second destroyer passed above. For a moment, the sonar pulses overlapped, creating a discordant chorus that filled the submarine like the beating of two metal hearts. The sound was unbearable. Men covered their ears. Then the sea erupted. Depth charges descended in perfect sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, each spaced to trap them in a lattice of pressure. The detonations rippled through the hull, smashing gauges and extinguishing lights. Battery acid spilled onto the deck, hissing as it mixed with seawater. A pipe burst aft, spraying the engineering compartment with steam. Still, the submarine held. Takamura wiped blood from his ear and ordered a turn to starboard, engines half. The hull creaked under the strain, but the boat responded, sliding through layers of cold water. The sonar pings shifted behind them slower, weaker. Perhaps they had slipped beneath the thermocline. For 10 minutes, there was only the hum of machinery and the rasp of labored breathing. Hope flickered. Then, from the darkness ahead, a new ping, clearer, closer, and perfectly aligned. The destroyers had adjusted again, their sonar beams now compensating for the thermal layer. The illusion of safety dissolved. Takamura closed his eyes. "They are reading the ocean," he said quietly. The next attack came with devastating precision. The explosions walked from stern to bow, each closer than the last. The pressure wave from the final charge hurled men to the floor, shattering bulbs and denting bulkheads. One of the forward torpedo tubes split open. Seawater roared in. The captain ordered, "Blow main ballast. Surface." The crew hesitated. Surfacing meant death, but staying below meant crushing pressure and drowning. They obeyed. The submarine rose sluggishly, the sound of rushing, bubbles filling the compartments. The destroyers heard it instantly. The sonar pings stopped. Engines roared above. Searchlights stabbed through the waves. When the Japanese submarine broke the surface, it was met by tracer fire and the blinding beams of American lights. The crew spilled onto the deck, some shouting, others weeping. Within minutes, shells tore through the conning tower. Flames erupted. Below, the chief engineer stayed at his post, recording one last entry in the log before the water reached his throat. "The enemy has learned to see in darkness." At 1,000 feet, the ocean had whispered the truth. Technology had replaced instinct, and courage alone could no longer save them. The Americans had not just hunted their submarine, they had rewritten the laws of the deep. By May of 1944, the Japanese submarine force no longer commanded the ocean, it endured it. The American destroyers had turned the sea into a calculated battlefield, where every echo was a clue and every silence a trap. Beneath those same waters, men like Lieutenant Commander Takamura fought not just to survive, but to understand the unseen weapon that now ruled their world. On the surface, the destroyer escorts USS Whitehurst and USS England moved through calm seas west of Truk, their wakes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Beneath them, sound travelled farther than light. The ocean had become an acoustic medium for warfare, where decibels mattered more than speed. Every turn of the propeller, every vibration in the hull, was a signal to be read. Inside the sonar room of Whitehurst, the hum of electricity filled the air. Two sailors leaned over the glowing face of the QHB sonar scope. One adjusted the gain knob by fractions of an inch, another marked bearings on a plotting board. They spoke in clipped tones, numbers, ranges, bearings, language stripped of emotion. The destroyer's commander waited for their verdict like a surgeon listening for a heartbeat. "Echo steady," came the voice through the intercom. bearing 271, range 1,200 yards, contact slow and deep. The captain nodded once. Very well. Maintain contact. They were not hunting ghosts anymore. They were dissecting one. Each ping that left the ship's transducer travelled outward at roughly 1,500 meters per second. When it struck a solid object steel, not coral or rock, it returned a slightly altered echo. The sonar operator could tell by the tone whether it was hull, debris, or false reflection. In earlier wars, finding a submarine had been like chasing smoke. Now, it was arithmetic. The Americans had learned that silence itself was a signature. A submarine running silent still produced heat, still displaced water, still altered the surrounding acoustic field. With sensitive enough equipment, even the absence of sound could betray position. Back at Pearl Harbor, physicists at the University of California and the Naval Research Laboratory were developing the next generation of passive hydrophones arrays that could listen across miles of ocean without revealing their own position. The Japanese, still relying on primitive hydrophones with ranges under 1,000 meters, could not imagine such reach. In Tokyo, the Navy's submarine command received fragments of intelligence. Reports spoke of new American sound devices capable of detection through thermoclines. Some officers dismissed them as Allied propaganda. Others knew better. They had seen the pattern boats vanishing without distress calls, their last transmissions ending mid-sentence. Meanwhile, in Washington, Admiral Ernest King read combat dispatches with satisfaction. The numbers spoke for themselves. In 1942, Allied anti-submarine forces in the Pacific had averaged 1 confirmed kill for every 45 depth-charge attacks. By the spring of 1944, that ratio had improved to 1 kill for every 7. The difference was sound. The sonar revolution did not come without human cost. Operators endured endless hours in dark compartments, their ears assaulted by constant noise. Many suffered permanent hearing damage. Some reported auditory hallucinations, hearing phantom pings long after leaving duty. Yet they continued, driven by quiet pride. They knew they were the unseen front line of the new naval war. Back in the depths, Takamura's surviving crew learned to read those same sounds like a death sentence written in Morse. After each engagement, they would sit in darkness, recounting what they had heard, the intervals between pings, the modulation of tone, the direction of approach. Slowly, the pattern emerged. The Americans no longer hunted by instinct, but by equation. They adjusted to survive. Some captains ordered oil drums filled with compressed air to be released at different depths to confuse sonar. Others tried radical maneuvers, descending steeply into temperature layers, cutting engines, and drifting in total silence. It worked, sometimes. But even these tricks began to fail as the Americans improved their range gating and signal discrimination. What the Japanese did not know was that every failed evasion became data. Each contact recorded, analyzed, refined the algorithms of sonar interpretation. The Americans were not just hunting submarines, they were teaching their machines how to hunt better. By the summer of 1944, the U.S. Navy was already developing variable depth sonar, lowering transducers below the surface layers that once shielded submarines. The ocean's last sanctuary was disappearing. For Takamura and his men, the realization was complete. Their enemy no longer searched blindly. The Americans could see through the ocean, charting the unseen world with sound. The Japanese submariners were no longer fighting ships, but an idea, a synthesis of science, production, and patience beyond anything they could match. In his final log entry before his submarine vanished from all records, Takamura wrote, "The sea has become clear. We once believed in shadows and courage. Now even shadows betray us. We are heard before we are seen, measured before we are known. The enemy no longer hunts, he calculates." In that single sentence lay the truth of the new war. The age of the warrior was ending. The age of the engineer had begun. Above, the destroyers resumed their slow patrol, the rhythmic pinging echoing through the night. Each pulse was a statement of dominance, each echo a memory of those who had once believed the deep would hide them. The Americans had learned to see in darkness, and the ocean would never be silent again. June of 1944. The Philippine Sea shimmered under a cruel sun. Waves rolled in lazy arcs, concealing within their depths the remnants of a fleet and the ghosts of a doctrine. Below those warm waters, Japanese submarines still hunted, but the hunt had become suicide wrapped in ritual. Lieutenant Commander Takamura's final patrol, though unrecorded in official Japanese archives, lived on in fragments. Sonar logs from the American destroyer USS Spangler, fragments of intercepted communications, and a few pages recovered from a waterlogged notebook found drifting days later. Together, they formed the anatomy of inevitability, the precision with which America had learned to measure death. By mid-1944, sonar was no longer a single invention. It was a system, a network of tools, tactics, and minds, synchronized into one rhythm. Every American escort, from the Whitehurst in the Central Pacific to the England in the Solomons, carried the same pulse, the metallic heartbeat of active sonar, a weapon of certainty that rendered concealment obsolete. The destroyers no longer relied solely on hearing. They had combined radar, high-frequency direction finding, and sonar into a single continuous loop of detection. Planes patrolling above could fix the bearing of a periscope with centimetric radar. Destroyers below could take over the pursuit, narrowing the circle with sonar. Once trapped, the Japanese submarine faced the same fate every time: contact, pursuit, calibration, annihilation. It was not luck, it was a process. From American archives, the attack report of USS Spangler on June 23 reads with clinical detachment: 21:16 sonar contact, bearing 208, range 1800 yards. 21:18 contact, classified as submarine by echo profile, depth approximately 270 feet. 21:21 target, attempting evasive turn to port. Maintaining contact. Hedgehog fired. 21:22 multiple explosions, debris and oil sighted, contact lost. That was how history now recorded a man's death: 4 lines of text, 6 minutes of data, 1 less name. Inside Takamura's submarine, the moment before the end had been agony stretched over mathematics. The crew knew they were detected. The sonar pings had a specific rhythm: 1, 2, 3, pause, adjust. The Americans were zeroing in, not through sight or instinct, but through equations solved in real time. The sonar operator, his hands trembling, counted aloud the intervals between pings. 2 seconds, 1.5, now 1. The numbers told their story more clearly than words. The destroyer was closing in. The captain whispered, "They are solving us." He was right. The Americans had turned sound into geometry. Each ping measured the time it took for the echo to return, and each second of delay gave range. Successive bearings plotted on graph paper revealed a triangle, the precise coordinates of death. Once that triangle closed, the destroyer fired its Hedgehog mortars forward in a perfect pattern, a circle of 24 small explosives that only detonated upon impact. It was a weapon designed not to guess, but to confirm. Above, in Spangler's sonar shack, 2 operators in headphones listened as the echoes changed. Pitch. They could tell the submarine had altered course by the Doppler shift alone, the frequency bending with motion. When the echo steadied, the lead operator spoke softly. "He's turning into us. Fire." The captain gave the order. "Hedgehog away." The depth charge pattern fell like a hammer into the sea. 24 projectiles sank in a tightening arc, silent until the first one struck steel. The explosion was sharp, almost surgical. Then 3 more followed. The sonar screen went blank, no more echo, only static. For a few moments, the Americans waited in silence. Then a faint shimmer of oil rose through the water, followed by air bubbles that spread like a dark blossom. On the bridge, the commander of Spangler removed his cap and said quietly, "Mark kill, continue sweep." Below, what remained of Takamura's submarine began its slow descent. Compartments filled, lights flickered, and the hull screamed under the weight of the ocean. In the flickering darkness, one man continued writing, his pencil scratching against wet paper. His final words were later found clinging to that notebook. They have made the sea an equation, each sound a number, each life a variable to be solved. We no longer fight, we are measured. It was a truth too terrible and too beautiful to deny. The Americans had not just invented a weapon, they had invented a philosophy. To them, warfare was a problem of efficiency. The sonar ping was not a cry for battle, but a calculation in progress. By autumn of that same year, the numbers spoke for themselves. The Imperial Japanese Navy had begun the war with more than 100 submarines. By the end of 1944, over 70 lay destroyed, many without ever sighting the enemy. Each loss represented another data point in the vast statistical machine that America had built. Factories, laboratories, and training schools, united by purpose. What the Japanese had called valor, the Americans called process. What the Japanese believed was fate, the Americans treated as an engineering challenge. In the months that followed, sonar would grow even deadlier. The QHB set gave way to the new QDA with automatic range tracking. Destroyer escorts no longer plotted by hand. Machines did the math faster. Operators could now track 2 targets simultaneously. The sea itself became transparent. Its secrets dissolved into waves of sound and probability. And in that clarity, something ancient was lost, the mystery that had once protected those who travelled the depths. The ocean, once the last refuge of darkness, had been mapped, measured, and mastered. Where men had once hidden in the blind womb of the sea, they now died under the unblinking gaze of technology. The mathematics of death had replaced the poetry of courage. And from the Bridge of Spangler, as the sun rose over a calm Pacific horizon, the sonar men resumed their steady work, ping, mark, record, repeat. For the Americans, it was victory. For the Japanese beneath them, it was the end of sound itself. July of 1944. The Pacific had changed color. What once shimmered blue and infinite now seemed darker, heavy with oil and wreckage. The waves rolled over graves invisible to the sky, the resting places of men who had once ruled these waters. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the pride of an empire, had become a whisper beneath the sea. From Guam to Truk, the American destroyer escorts continued their steady patrols, their sonar pings echoing like a metronome across the ocean floor. Each sound carried both a question and an answer. Is there life below? And always, in reply, came silence or the faint metallic echo of another submarine dying in the dark. In the months after Lieutenant Commander Takamura's disappearance, the Americans no longer viewed submarine hunting as combat. It had become routine. The sonar operators of the USS England, USS Spangler, and USS Whitehurst spoke of contacts and echoes the way. Machinists speak of parts. War had turned mechanical. At the submarine base in Yokosuka, the Japanese command tried to understand what was happening. The remaining fleet boats returned, damaged, shaken, their captains hollow-eyed. None had escaped without hearing the sound that now haunted the Imperial Navy, that perfect, metallic ping. Reports flowed into Tokyo. Enemy destroyers maintain constant contact regardless of maneuver. Thermal layers no longer provide concealment. Multiple ships coordinate attack as if reading each other's thoughts. The old generation of admirals refused to believe it. They spoke of luck, of divine favor, of temporary setbacks. But the younger officers, men who had survived the new American tactics, knew the truth. The ocean itself had turned against them. The Americans had learned to listen to the sea, and the sea had answered. By late July, new Japanese submarines leaving Kure and Sasebo did so under no illusions. They sailed with reduced crews, fewer torpedoes, and heavier hearts. Their mission was no longer victory but endurance. "Return if you can," one admiral told them. "If not, die bravely." Yet bravery no longer mattered. On July 19th, south of Saipan, I-169 crept along the seabed, engines off, batteries fading. Above her, the USS Wyman circled in slow arcs, pinging methodically. The Americans had learned a new trick, alternating active and passive sonar in sequence, forcing submarines to reveal themselves through minute vibrations. Inside I-169, the captain ordered silence. Even speech seemed dangerous. The crew sat barefoot on the steel deck, their ears pressed to the hull, listening for salvation that would never come. The pings grew louder. Then, silence. Then explosions, not the random concussions of early war depth charges, but deliberate, spaced bursts designed to compress water in calculated waves. The submarine's lights flickered, seams split. Men prayed. Then the sea rushed in. On the surface, Wyman's sonar operators logged the moment without emotion. Contact lost at 14:17. Oil and debris observed. Confirmed kill. The report went to Pearl Harbor, was typed, stamped, and filed. A single line in a thick binder, the bureaucratic language of apocalypse. By summer's end, the Imperial Navy had lost nearly 80% of its submarine force. Those few that remained were confined to coastal waters, ordered to attack invasion convoys near the Philippines. But even there, they found no refuge. The Americans had extended their acoustic net to the entire Pacific. Subchasers, patrol craft, and aircraft equipped with sonobuoys formed an unbroken chain of listening posts. Sonobuoys, small floating microphones dropped by aircraft, were the final expression of the new warfare. Each buoy transmitted underwater sound directly to the aircraft circling above. The ocean that had once hidden submarines had become a giant ear. In August, during a test off Guam, an American patrol aircraft dropped a line of sonobuoys into the sea. Within minutes, the operator heard a faint rhythmic thump diesel engines far below. He radioed coordinates to the destroyer group nearby. The ships moved in, coordinated their approach, and within 15 minutes, another Japanese submarine vanished. When the news reached Tokyo, the Admiralty no longer issued public statements. The submarine corps was dying faster than ships could be built. Even the most patriotic newspapers had grown silent. And yet, in a way, silence was fitting. The Japanese submariners had entered the war as masters of stealth and silence. They were ending it as victims of a more perfect silence, the one created by total destruction. At night, in the darkened sonar compartments of American ships, young sailors leaned back in their chairs, removing their headphones for a moment. Outside, the sea was calm, moonlight reflecting off the water. They could not see the wrecks below, but they knew they were there, hundreds of steel coffins scattered across the seafloor. One sonar operator, writing in his diary aboard USS Whitehurst, captured the contradiction of their victory. Every ping we send means someone dies below. It is clean, efficient, and final. But when the sea goes quiet again, I can still hear it ringing inside my head. Maybe the ocean remembers. By autumn, the Pacific was full of such memories, silent, invisible, but enduring. The sonar pings that had once marked progress and precision now seemed almost funereal. For the Americans, the sea had become transparent. For the Japanese, it had become solid, a black wall closing around them. And so the deep, which had hidden the secrets of the earth for 1,000,000 years, was no longer mysterious. It had been measured, mapped, and mastered. The ocean had been conquered not by courage or by fleet, but by sound. And when the last Japanese submarine slipped beneath the waves without surfacing again, the Pacific itself seemed to sigh not in triumph, but in resignation. The silence that followed was absolute.